Hello and welcome. It's 12:31. We are 1 minute late because I was hearing all about the entire set of a Long Beach opera show that is stuck on a boat, unable to come in due to the pandemic. There is so
LA,
much.
LA Opera, LA
Oh,
Opera.
sorry, LA Opera. Um, if you are here to talk about the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the performing arts industry and the innovations that so many live theater creators, executives have had to create to kind of keep going, you are in the right place. So my name is Beth Spotswood. I'm Alta's digital editor, and I am going to do a little bit of light housekeeping before we kick this off. Today, I am so excited as I'm a hardcore theater nerd, to welcome two people who help bring extraordinary live performance to California and beyond. James Darrah is the artistic director of the Long Beach Opera. He is the subject of an Alta Journal feature by contributor Catherine Womack, who's here to moderate for us today. He has projects all over the country. He is incredible. It's a coup to get him today. We're also joined by Jennifer Bielstein, the executive director of San Francisco's legendary American Conservatory Theater. Jennifer and James, as well as their organizations, have done extraordinary work in response to the COVID-19 pandemic to continue bringing audiences, both new and old, incredible content during this extraordinarily difficult year and a half. Very quickly, if you are unfamiliar with Alta Journal, we are a quarterly focused on California and the West. If you like what you see here today, and I hope that you do, I hope you will check us out at altaonline.com, because that is where you can find a recording of this. I am receiving even now emails of people saying they are so sorry they can't make it. Will this be recorded? Yes, don't worry. If you've got to leave early, if you're coming late, this interview in its entirety will be recorded, posted to altaonline.com, and emailed to you later today. There's a Q&A button down at the bottom here. Please use that, as well as the chat feature. I always like to ask people to start the chat off by letting me know where they are. I'm in Novato, California. Let us know where you are in the chat. And the last 5 minutes of this will go to about 1 o'clock. Last 5 minutes will be Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alta Journal writer extraordinaire, Catherine Womack.
Thank you for being here today. I'm really excited about this conversation, and we'll just jump right in. So this is a really interesting moment that we're in right now, kind of a transitional moment, pandemic-wise, in terms of presenting live theater. We're doing it now, but we've spent the last 18 months pivoting to digital. So I'd love to hear from both of you. What have you learned over these last 18 months, especially in terms of producing digital theatrical presentations that you think you might continue to utilize post-pandemic?
Sure, I can jump in. So, gosh, we've learned so much, so much. I mean, at ACT, we've created, 15 different productions, either for Zoom or commissioned as a piece to be created live over Zoom, or recorded straight for film, adapted and recorded straight for film. So many things. And it's been interesting to share that work across the country and across the world during the pandemic. So it's definitely, we've had people from all over the world, from many different countries, see what we've done. But there's been sometimes great response to what we've put out there, and sometimes minimal response to what we've put out there. And I think it will be very interesting post-COVID, or whenever COVID's at a level that's manageable and safe for us to be in person more, to continue trying to put things out there, because it was hard to tell if people at one point were just oversaturated with being online and watching digital virtual work or Netflix or whatever it is that they were tired of screens, we think, at some moments in time, and that sometimes they were really hungry for it. So I think I want us to keep trying that and see what we do when we're back into a different, I don't even want to say normal, whatever the next kind of phase is of the way we kind of operate as a society. And I think for me, from the theater field perspective, we've just gained just such a greater comfort level with doing this work, whereas pre-COVID, there was much resistance to it, much concern about bootlegging or pirating of the work, reasonable concerns about intellectual property, but a lot of worry that it would just get out of hand. So I'm glad that we can kind of learn from this and hopefully keep doing things and experimenting and growing our field and our audiences.
Yeah, and I'll go. Thank you, Beth, for the introduction. And what's interesting is I feel like I'm at a place where I'm just joining Long Beach Opera, so I'm relatively new there. So I don't have, even though Long Beach Opera did co-produce something that I worked on the whole year. I don't have the same. It's interesting to hear your frame of reference, Jennifer, about like company-wise, because I feel like I have that as a freelance artist working with different companies, and sort of last year realizing, to be totally frank, like which companies were interested in going that direction and which companies like were kind of unimaginative and didn't want to go there and didn't want to listen or give that the time of day. So as like a freelance artist who then would come in and sort of, some of it was salvaging projects that as things were getting canceled left and right. I actually went to a few companies and a few executive directors that are in your position at opera companies and just said, hey, opera hasn't really engaged with this sphere very much out of a hesitancy to let go of live performance. And what would it look like if we did that? What would it look like if we actually sort of embrace some of the aspects of digital work or film and cinema? Like, what if we start to pull that into this sphere? What does that look like? I feel like what that did teach me is that, to your point about, screen fatigue, what I kind of felt like was that the traditional opera audience, not to be hyperbolic about it, but like the audience that is like diehard opera fans that go to the live theater were the most hesitant to take on any sort of like film adaptation of an opera or even digital content on a screen. That said, there were, key supporters, key people in key places that were interested in it or funded it or like really got behind it in terms of with the companies. But I actually found that doing this type of work actually reached an audience that wasn't an audience that had ever been to an opera. And that it was actually the ability to put something in front of someone, knowing that everyone's carrying around a screen supercomputer in their pocket, was really interesting to sort of embrace that side of the technology and say, what if, whether it was a chamber orchestra that I was working with or an opera company, but to say, what if we create something that's intended to be viewed that way and intended for that? And it was interesting to see that there's an audience for that material and that people were really, really ready to engage with that in key places. I also feel like it opened up a lot. I learned a lot about creators and other designers or makers or directors or filmmakers in particular who have never been invited to play in the opera space. Opera is really good. I like to say opera is really good at making people outside of the opera medium play big opera. Like it's really good at inviting people in and then being like, here's all the rules you need to follow. And film the interesting thing was to realize opera had a lot to give. There was a lot of like me pushing for more leeway in the form to make space for people from other mediums. And I feel like I just scratched the surface of that. But meeting a lot of people, especially in the filmmaking communities here in LA, whether it was actors or filmmakers, directors, editors, that's really cinematographers, for instance. That was really exciting to me to feel like there was a whole network of people there, Catherine, that I wanted to pull into my world as an artist working with various producers.
You touched on this a little bit, but let's talk about audiences. I didn't live in a big city like New York or LA for most of my life. And I got a lot of my information about what was cool in opera or theater by reading online reviews and imagining what it looked like. And I loved the idea that during the pandemic, people all over the world, no matter where they lived in any small town, could log on and see some of the world's best theater and opera. So, but from your perspectives, what happened to your audiences? Did they expand? Did they change? Was that, let's start with you, Jennifer.
Sure. So we had a couple thousand people sign on for a pass that gave them access to all of the virtual work that we did all season. And that virtual work, as I was describing before, the 15 different pieces, some were plays made for Zoom, and they would have nights where they were performed live over Zoom. And then we also had recordings of them that you could watch on demand for several weeks after. And then some were entirely live and some entirely recorded. So kind of ran the gamut of it. So we had a couple of thousand people who signed up for passes to all of that. And then it ranged, from several thousand to a piece. And I know some theaters around the country with their versions of A Christmas Carol, they had 150 to 250,000 people watch it. So like more than they ever had when they did it in person. We didn't have that experience, but we did provide ours free to the Bay Area for educators, essential frontline workers and such, and had thousands of people see it, but not the 250,000 that kind of tuned in other communities. But it was fascinating to see with almost every production that we did, how many people from around the globe tuned in for the work. I think we were hoping for that and maybe expecting it a little, but then still surprised and delighted each time when you would see Australia pop up, or Switzerland or Finland or Russia, whatever it was, wherever they were tuning in from. So we expanded, but the only way we will likely keep those folks involved is if we continue with digital work in some capacity. Otherwise, they would have to travel here to see it, and maybe they will. San Francisco is a great place to visit, but I don't know that they'll come here, 5-7 times a year.
Yeah, James, can you talk a little bit about the LA Chamber Orchestra audience that you developed with the YouTube videos?
Yeah. LA Chamber Orchestra got a new executive director who was very progressive and forward thinking, and who started literally, I think, right before the pandemic started. So, and we connected at a certain point, and they invited me to kind of curate 14 online episodes of content, rethinking their chamber music season that had already been programmed. And we ended up putting that for free on YouTube online. And they crested 1.5 million views before the end of the year at a certain point. And I think now we're closer to 2. And their audiences, expanded globally. And I know from the little that I know in terms of metrics, not only did it bring in some new support, fiscally to their organization, but they really just developed a robust online audience that both was able to engage with their existing LA audience that was missing the sort of intimacy of a chamber orchestra and those live concerts. I think they also made a couple of people connected to the organization kind of mad, the idea of like, why are we doing visual art things with this chamber music? But I think the benefit of it far outweighed that, which was, I look at some of the episodes that we put on YouTube, very quickly over the course of like 4 days would go over 100,000 views, which most opera companies or orchestras consider 4,000 views a success, right? If you put that online. And so I think, for me as an artist, I was like, wow, this is like a massive amount of people suddenly engaging with, a piece of chamber music that would otherwise be done in a hall that holds 1,000 people or less. And that was really intriguing, was to realize that there was kind of an online audience that was excited to sort of see what that could develop and what could happen with that. That's sort of short form episodic content that's on YouTube and is free. I like to say that's a classical music company, whether it's an opera or a chamber orchestra, using the internet the way that it works, which is like putting stuff on YouTube that can be aggregated and added to places and done in different ways. But the long form content had a different issue, which was kind of rethinking how you market that content. And I'm sure, Jennifer, you guys had a lot of conversations about that, about, how do you market a long form thing if you're an opera company making a film of an opera? How do you now straddle those spheres in a way that feels authentic? So we had a lot of conversations around authenticity and like who's working on the projects. And even with LA Chamber Orchestra, I was adamant that we pull in people from the worlds of film, from TV, screenwriters, people that are used to thinking of everything in a sort of digital frame. That felt really important to me, to sort of invite new players in the creation of something new.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could add on, with the piece so we had a piece called Animal Wisdom that we were doing in partnership with Woolly Mammoth Theater out of DC. And it was originally going to be on both of our stages, but the creative team led by Heather Christian converted it to be filmed. And so brought in people from the film world as well to to realize that. And it was really spectacular. And then in terms of the short form free content, I didn't mention we had something that we launched called Interact at Home, and have hundreds of things on our YouTube channel where taking scenes from plays that we had done before, and you might hear the director, like in a director's cut, telling what was going on stage at the time, or a designer or choreographer or podcast and things like that to further the digital engagement during this time. And I think we will continue those with certainty.
I don't think I think it's correct to say that the last 18 months have kind of been a seismic shift for performing arts. Like, it's been one of the biggest things that's happened in this sector in terms of just having to react so quickly and then over a long period of time. But not just because of the pandemic. I mean, we also dealt with a racial reckoning in 2020 that I think affected the arts as well. And I'm curious, after these 18 months of this challenging and changing time, when you look ahead 5 years, what does the programming look like for your organization? Does it look like it did in 2019 or 2018? Or does it look radically different? And kind of what have we experienced over the last 18 months that will alter the future of what you program?
Yeah, in terms of racial equity and racial justice, so I work in partnership with Pam McKinnon, who is our artistic director, and she and I both started at right about the same time, about 3 years ago. And already under her artistic leadership, she and we were really looking at and making decisions about what are the stories that we tell, whose stories are we telling, and who is telling those stories, and really looking at the voices represented, the people represented, the themes represented in what we do, and really meaningfully diversifying the work and the stories that we were telling on our stages in terms of gender, race, and ethnic diversity in particular. So that's something already begun pre-COVID and will certainly continue and grow and be amplified as we come out of this pandemic. And then I think we all have to really be in touch with our local communities and really engaged and listening and responsive and interacting with, so that we can continue to do work and develop work that resonates with our local community and that is representative of the beautiful diversity of our local communities. So I think, you know, as you're saying, looking into the future, I imagine that is what will inform our work going forward, is what is it that the Bay Area needs from ACT, and how do we really represent the people of this community with the stories that they want to hear that are resonant with them on our stages.
Yeah, I would say at Long Beach Opera in particular, we're looking at many of the same things about programming and stories, and what stories are we telling, and who are we, who are we bringing into the sphere to create work, and why, and what, really, I think searching for a way that I said the other day, it is no longer sufficient for us to just say, oh, we're doing these 4 operas and here's our season, right? That we need to program projects that actually are, that feel culturally relevant, but that actually address our core values as a company and as individual artists, and as a company that is equitable and just. Every single thing we produce needs to really be constantly fulfilling that mission. And I think in pursuit of that, the other thing that we're doing is completely restructuring the company. I think a lot of what last year brought up was that, especially in opera, the systems that exist in the form and the structures that exist in companies are predominantly problematic and systemically problematic for artists of color, and for equitable and just access to the form, not only for audiences, but for people within it, both in leadership positions, but also in just company-wide in terms of people that are making the art for the artists. And so we're looking at ways to think about how our arts nonprofit is structured and completely change it. So we've created a leadership council. We've created projects that feel spearheaded by people that are embedded in the organization and that check all of our values and bolster those, but that maybe is different than me now being the new artistic director and sort of dictatorially deciding every single thing that the company is going to do. I think it's really, for me, it's like, I think in 5 years, the company is a place that is making space for multiple inputs, and that those inputs are by nature of really bringing great artists together, just, equitable, and diverse. But it also means that I am really intrigued by I feel like I barely scratched the surface last year of what opera and classical music is capable of within the visual digital space and film. And I really think that the future of season planning and performance is a really robust investment in that. And that's not always a popular opinion in opera. I get a lot of, you'd be surprised the amount of hate mail I get about how I'm like destroying opera from within by doing some of these projects, including people that won't even review it or look at it, right? Because it's digital and it's digital content. It should go away after the pandemic, and we should just have everything that we've had. And I would argue that that's a systemic problem. Like Catherine, you're mentioning reading reviews growing up from big cities. And, I'm very vocal about, even the people that are writing about the work, if they're not writing about that from a community that's underserved and not invited to opera, why would they bother to come? You want to see yourself reflected both in the writing about and the narratives that build around projects, but also you want the leadership of your company to reflect the diversity that you're seeking to program in terms of your stories as well. So those are big ideas, I realize, and really intense ones. But with me, at Long Beach, we have Alexander Gideon and Darrell Akon and Jennifer Rivera, who's the CEO General Director, the four of us, and our new music director, Chris Roundtree, who's here in LA and certainly shares a lot of these same goals. The five of us we are having constant meetings, kind of looking at some of these bigger problems and thinking about, with a company the size of Long Beach that kind of has a history of being a little bit of an instigator. I feel like, I keep saying, like, let's make the bold decision and get in trouble for it and change things, rather than just adhering to some of the systemic structural problems that have existed that I think perpetuate some of these things that, that came up last year.
Yeah, I want to amplify, James, what you said about the systemic issues, right, that are pervasive in our organizations, and the structural issues. So beyond programming, that's also a huge part of the work we've been doing and really amplified this past year. And in the theater world, there's been a huge rallying of artists and theater makers, theater practitioners across the country who have come together and have presented demands, ideas, needs, recommendations through the form of something called We See You White American Theater. There's a local version in the Bay Area called the BIPOC Equity Action Plan. And it's really been certainly painful for people going through it and reliving traumas and frustrations and experiences that they've had, but they've put out there the needs of like this. These are very specific needs we have and things that will make a difference if you can implement them. So as an organization, we've spent hours, weeks, months, a year plus going through those and incorporating some of those things. Of course, there are some we're already doing, but the ones that we weren't, incorporating those so that when we return to in-person performances and are bringing people together in person, that we're addressing those and not repeating past practices that have been harmful to anyone.
I could sit here and pick your brains all day, but let's let some other people ask questions. Beth, do you want to bring in some audience Q&A?
Sure. So, and I will ask on your behalf again that we've got people chiming in already, and I've got a couple of emails, but use the Q&A button if you have questions. One comes from B. Lindsay. How do you identify trans, GNC, intersex, BIPOC folks in creative projects, creative teams, etc.?
I'm happy to start there. And that's an excellent, I love this question from B. Lindsay, because I feel like trans, gender nonconforming, intersex, BIPOC, and in general queer narratives in opera are vastly underserved and not told in a way that makes me excited about working on those projects. And I think it's something where myself, as a queer person, I don't feel like I see myself represented in a lot of operatic stories, and certainly not in a lot of the history of the canon. But in terms of projects themselves, and how we identify creative teams, I also am very adamant that no one person claim to be the authority and know who to pull into those projects. That, I really have tried, with Long Beach, we've talked about, if we're going to do something, if our goal is to amplify, for instance, one of my things is transgender opera singers exist and are very treated very poorly actually in the industry, and there's a lot of conflicting thoughts about what that means in terms of voice and what roles, quote unquote, you're appropriate for. And I think, where I stand is really trying to think of people that I may know, other artists who I may admire, whose work I admire, right? Art as a subjective thing. I look at who's making art that is a trans person or is a gender nonconforming person that is making art that I'm excited about, and then go to that person and engage with them and either invite them to make a project that they're passionate about, or say, hey, I have this opera and I want you to help me, guide me on who should fulfill those roles. So to really kind of take away what I think is this sort of idea of one person holding all of the keys and all of the answers, and to make space. I think it's really about space and creating new projects, but also in terms of teams, really feeling like you are relying on an awareness and a space to kind of, I like to think of it as like a wider radar, right? And opera doesn't always have the widest radar. So in terms of culture and its place in the world. And so, constantly both in our staff doing a lot of work to like have everyone kind of feel like they're taking things in. And we've talked about ways to do that, about, how to attend a performance artist who I love, who's gender nonconforming. Like, let's have the whole leadership team go see that performance, not just me. Let's have people, let's invite people into our space, and then trust them and listen to them. I think is definitely part of the plan.
Yeah, I would ditto all of that. Thank you. And yeah, I think just specifically for us, adding to that is, in selecting the creative teams of a show, it's a team, it's not just one voice, but ensuring that it's a representative team, not a homogenous creative team in any way. And in terms of identifying people, like in the theater field, they're actually curated list and crowdsourced list of designers and directors and actors and theater workers and such out there who are not gender binary, not cisgender or BIPOC, and that is really helpful. Like these were pulled together to say there's no excuse for not knowing who's out there. And then we were about to go into day one of rehearsal just after we shut down because of the pandemic for the Rocky Horror Show. And for that show, the creative team, we held open auditions in the Bay Area where anyone could come out, union, non-union, everyone, and audition. And we identified a lot of great talent, and most of the roles were cast from those open auditions. And maybe one day we'll get to do that show and bring that group back together again.
I hope so. Scarlett asks, and it's kind of in line with the equity conversation. Scarlett in LA, how do you make opera, and I think that, live performance in general, more affordable? It's usually prohibitively expensive. And I think that, you spoke a bit about the free video online. The pandemic has kind of allowed this free content to be delivered. But when you reopen, is that something to consider for in-person live performances?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go ahead and say this because then it's on video and you can hold me to it. But I think certainly real content, like people like to use the word digital content, and I think filming a stage performance and putting it online is not actual original content. So I think it's creating original content specifically for the screen, the same way that film and TV does that. And we all have streaming programs that we watch television shows. Opera needs to engage with that and make it really inexpensive and or free and available to everybody. That's step one, but it can't end there. And Jennifer Rivera and I at Long Beach have talked about, and I really believe that this is the future. I want us to have one, if not several performances of every single thing we do in opera live be pay what you can. So that, and I think it's a model that is untested in opera, and we're kind of looking for ways to think about whether it's having funding to explore that and get some metrics around how to do that. You know, Jennifer, I'd be interested if you guys have explored that at all. Like, I think theater maybe has more exploration possibilities within that. Opera has not, to my knowledge, really explored pay what you can, but a way to do that that feels equitable and just and reaches people where it is not about you having to buy a $400 ticket to go to the opera. And then some of it, I would say the last part, the third part of it, which I'm also very adamant about, and also gets me some hate mail, is opera really does a disservice by thinking of itself as elitist. And, you know, people think of opera, like, you'd be surprised how many times I talk about Long Beach Opera and they're like, oh, does it have a big gilded red carpeted opera house? And I'm like, no, like opera needs to be a form that's combining a lot of different art forms, but is really accessible and demystified and fun and hip and cool, and not something that you feel like if you're not wearing a tuxedo, you're not invited. Like, I want everybody to feel that they could walk through the door of any theater Long Beach's opera is occupying, and they should be able to afford the ticket. And if they can't, we should have a program in place where they still get to see the show. And pay what you can, I think, is the future of that for the opera world.
Yeah, and we did a lot of pay what you can for our digital work this past year, from $5 to $100, and you know, most people pick the lower end, and some paid on the higher end, and it's complicated, right? Because the economics of what we both do are awful. Like the ticket revenues that we bring in don't even cover half the cost, right? To do it, they're expensive people-made art forms. But at the end of the month, everyone look out, we're coming out with a big announcement of something to this end in terms of the price barrier for this next season. So I'll be excited to share that later. But I will say, you know, embedded in our pricing, we have I know not everyone can even afford $25, but we do have $25 tickets available to every production that we do. And then there are some discounts beyond that, but just to ensure that there's some entry level pricing for each production.
What an 18 months to kind of go through this horrible health crisis, the very important racial reckoning, and kind of really start talking about inclusion. But it seems like there are kind of dramatic and important changes happening with organizations like yours. My last question before we wrap it up, I kind of want to bring it back to this past 18 months and the tragedy and the challenge of it all. Was very dramatic. Do you think that we're going to, in the next 5 years, 10 years, are we going to start to see that reflected in artistic expression on stage? Will there be a lot of pandemic operas and plays?
Can I jump in and just say that I think the answer to this is already yes, because I saw one last week in Palo Alto at Stanford. And it was a production of an opera company and an orchestra. And it was literally an opera singer singing about what it felt like to sing over a Zoom call to someone dying of COVID. And it was some of the most affecting art I've seen since I've kind of been going back to the theater, and it was rooted in this time period. And I thought, when I saw it, that it was very abstract and nonlinear, and it felt like very raw, like someone trying to get through, you know, my answer, I think, is yes, but I want to hear what you guys have to say.
I love that, because what you're talking about is the idea of like art embracing reality. Like, I keep saying, like, we all just need to like look around, and, you know, it's my same push with like opera occupying like film space, is like opera hasn't really done that, you know, in our lifetimes in a majorly meaningful way. But like, look around, we all like hold screens in our pockets. We all watch streaming shows. We all watched TV and movies during the pandemic. So why wouldn't that art form engage with that space? Like, and it's the same thing with reality of like, we all lived through that year. So like, to your point, Catherine, like, I similarly have a very allergic reaction to like going to a concert or something where they're like, let's pretend like nothing happened. I'm like, what? Like, how are you, you know, it seems inauthentic. It seems elitist again, which I obviously have an allergy to. And, I love the idea of art. I think art already, like making things, like certainly the things we're looking at doing in Long Beach are all about how do we look at the reality of the world we live in and make art that means something to people when they take the effort to get out of the house to go to it, right? Or they take the effort to turn on their TV and watch something that we've produced. Like, let's make that a meaningful experience and not just feel like we're doing the same thing that we were before the pandemic.
I would agree with all of that. I think there'll be some responses, some artistic responses that are immediate. And I think there'll be some down the line upon reflection, right? Of like, I think we're all theorizing on what will be changed in our lives because of this and what will be permanent and what will be temporary. And we'll know more in a few years too. And so I think there'll be some responses when we have, hopefully we have some distance then, hopefully this doesn't go on 3 more years, and have some perspective on it.
Catherine, do you remember the name of the production? I'm grabbing links and stuff. We're going to send everyone emails with all of this.
I reviewed it, and I'll send you a link to the review. It was called The No One's Rose. And it was produced by the Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra, which is in the Bay Area, and then also by a collective run by Matthew Aucoin, a composer that Alta has profiled before. And his organization, which is the American Modern Opera Company, AMOC, AMOC, like run amok kind of. And yeah, I'll send you the link to the review. And yeah, I would love to see it again because it felt so much different than what you were describing, like James, like going to the Hollywood Bowl and hearing someone play Beethoven and getting up and leaving, and we're all in our masks and there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And it felt like art that was immediate reaction, very, very visceral. But I love what you pointed out, Jennifer, that yes, artists are thinking and creating right now. They're processing what we're all processing. And so what will that theater look like? I mean, I can't wait to see it. I think it will evolve over time.
I'm also really excited because I know several artists in the opera sphere that like decided not to make anything during the year, right? And do other things. And I think we're going to see people who, I was crazy last year and like feel like I made a ton of stuff, but like, that was my visceral response to that period of time. And I'm excited to see what Catherine's suggesting is like, I think that we're going to see artists sort of reckoning with the trauma of the last year and maybe responding to that through their art in different mediums. I think it sounds horrible to say I'm excited to see that, but I think what excites me is the idea that art is very alive and feels, at its very best, it feels tethered to our current moment. And even if it's incorporating things from our past, and I just am not really interested in any artist who wants to pretend like last year didn't happen.
And that's the quote, folks. I love it. Well, art gives form to feeling. Let's, with that, everyone who's tuned in today, thank you so much. Don't worry. Again, this will all be online. We're going to include links to as much as we can grab off the internet of everything that James, Jennifer, and Catherine have talked about today, including, of course, their wonderful organizations, which I hope you will support. Before you go, save the date. Next week, we're going to take a 180 and talk about bee and butterfly conservation with scientist Serena Jepson, which it's incredibly important also. So thank you again to James, Jennifer, to Long Beach Opera, to ACT, and of course the wonderful Catherine Womack, Alta contributor. We are very, very grateful. Everyone take care, support theater and opera and artists, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.